Let's talk about cases. That's the short name. The full name is cases of charges in Xmatic software for medical offices, medical billing. Now we have some charges here in front of us, and a charge is usually uploaded to insurance companies. So that is what a charge is. It's a recording of information related to medical services that will be submitted usually to insurance companies. Let's take those two charges. Subselection, okay, so those two charges. And we see that the charge has a number and could have a case number. In this case, there is no case number. How do we bring those two charges into a case, that is, regroup them into an envelope that contains them? We have an application available. That application is called Charges into Cases of Charges. Takes charges, and we now see that we have a case number for both. The case number is the same because they are both in the same case. Here's the case. And the case took one of those charges as its title service and embedded the charges that were thrown into that case as the actual production charges. Let's open it. This is the title service, that is the service that is used to identify the case, to identify the envelope, and the two charges that we brought into the case are listed here as production charges. Now these two are physically the same as the charges in their own charge selection window. They are here presented as sub-records, but they're not really duplicated. This is the same data. So any modification of those charges in a charge input window will reflect into the sub-record area of the case. So let's verify that principle. Here we have a charge. I can bring that charge in a charge input form via the mini modify button. I modify this charge to, and I close it, and it is being brought back into the case, and the case is updated and modified. Now we go directly in the charge. At this point it's not yet updated because it has not been refreshed yet, but now I refresh it by doing Command O, which is get stored set. That brings the data freshly back from the server, and then we see that even in charges that amount was modified. I can also do the opposite, modify it here into 3. Okay, here again it's not yet modified because it needs to be refreshed, but if I refresh it, hop, and it is modified here. So this clearly shows that the data presented as sub-records area is basically the same as the data in the charge selection window. Okay, so we've seen the modify. You can also create a completely new charge. 99215. Okay. Save it. And we get that new charge included in our case. This is a default sort button, which serves also as a refresh, because if you give a sort command, the database will read the data fresh from disk. We also can eliminate a charge, but here you have to be careful, because that elimination is a physical elimination. It will really delete the charge completely. If you use the mini trash here, it will delete the charge even, so let's do the 5, the one that we just did, even in the charges window. So now that 99105 is physically removed also from the charges. Let's take a look at the inbound and outbound folder. The outbound arrow brings the sub-record charges into a charge selection window, and that gives us access to all the relational connections. It also allows us to modify that selection. Suppose we say no, we don't want to keep both. You select one, and the sub-selection has been removed, has been transformed into the case. The inbound is the opposite. It says, do you want to add charges that you have in the database but that are still standalone, that are not part of another charge? Do you want to add those charges into this case? You can select it, case is 0, and you bring an outside standalone charge into the case. So those are the mini buttons, the mini management buttons. All this data here, the top and here, is not uploaded. The data that is uploaded is as it appears on the charge input form as we see it here. Okay, so you may want to say, why do we then have all this data if it's not being used? For what purpose do we maintain all that data? Because of the propagating capabilities of this area. Suppose we want to put a 50 modifier on all the sub-record charges. We can propagate it into those charges, and if we open them now, we have the 50 modifier. We can remove an eventual modifier via the -1. So all of these additional areas, say we change this to birthing center, propagate it, and we have the birthing center here as the facility code. and we do it again, and now we have cleaned them. We can even modify the diagnosis profile. I've removed the diagnosis, propagate, and my underlying charges have both been updated. Now, this is already efficient with 2, but it becomes more and more efficient if you have 5 or 10 services that you want to maintain into one case. So these headers are useful to batch maintain the underlying subservices. A few special considerations. This button here and this button here are actually equivalent of re-entering the patient name or re-entering the service name. So if I click here, what I'm doing is I'm clearing the whole case out as if I'm retyping the patient in. Then the service remains the same at this point, but I can regenerate the creation of subservices by clicking on the services button. He goes then into the same cycle, presents to us the services that might be considered, and we get those services pre-calculated here again. We add another diagnosis. We propagate that diagnosis into this charges, etc., etc. So this greatly enhances the capabilities of doing batch modifications on a set of services that have been tight connected to each other within a case. Now, you will say, why did it give me, while I have only one service as the title or the master service? We call this one on the case level the master service or the title of the case service, while the other ones here are the production services. So why did it give us 2 services while there is only one selected here? Well, that's one of the major features of cases of charges billing. In order to understand that, we open the services input screen, and what do we see? This is the service, the title service or the master service. But within that service, we have the capability of entering sub-services. This is what is called object orientation. We can enter a larger number of services. In this case, there's only one. And what that does is, if you enter this, if you select this main service, it will also pull in its sub-services. And that's of course a great feature, because sometimes these master services contain a large number of sub-services, and they will then automatically be pulled in if this case is being recalculated. A click on this button does more or less the same. It presents us a choice of possible services and will add them into the list. In this particular case, we already had them. I can do another one just to show, or let's do all 3 of them, to show how advantageous volume updating is. Because suppose on all of them here, I want to add a ZO, what is it? The ZOOO. Okay. And we propagate this, and we now have in all of these CPTs this profile. So manipulating these propagation capabilities is very, very powerful. At the same time, the fact that we can enter subservices into main services allows us to create master or title services that reflect very much and very closely the procedures that are being performed in a medical practice. For instance, we see doctors' offices, general wellness visits, code them with a series of laboratory CPTs that they usually do for a wellness visit. So that capability is really key, goes really to the heart of what we call case billing. We don't have to create cases of charges via applications. That's what we did initially. By the way, there's also an application available under cases that takes all the charges, looks at all the charges in the database, and if they are not part of a case will be created. So that's an excellent way, a very powerful way of moving away from standalone charges billing into case billing. But once you are on the case billing bandwagon, you would normally simply go in here and create a new case from scratch from here, the way anybody would create cases from here. And we get our two services. We get a default diagnosis. I presume that default diagnosis, yes, was embedded into the main title service. So that's why we do have a default diagnosis. And we get here a pre-calculated series of new charges. More impressive is, let me see here, I think, if we do this, yes, for instance, this one. Look at this. See, all these services are connected to 97700. So suppose we needed to bill 97770. Oh, this one. Also, although they have been declared as sub-records from the main title service that we now selected, it is possible for each individual case to say, no, the other ones I don't want, I only want those. And you get those. See, now the power of case billing becomes more and more obvious, because in one entry you have a whole slew of related data that is generated based on only one main master service. By the way, the master service not being uploaded itself, unless it is repeated as a production service, does not need to be a CPT code. It can be an in-house code and an in-house title that corresponds more closely to the actual production services that are being provided in a specific environment. Now, just to show you how powerful this is in terms of productivity, we close this and then we project this case of charges on itself. So cases of charges with the shift key. And then we see that we created with limited amount of operator intervention the claims, the charges, and the cases all in once. So mastering this logic of case billing is key to a high productivity billing system. This is all ready for upload. Nothing needs to be done. The claims print run will pick those claims up and submit them without further operator intervention required. The question we ask ourselves now is, can Xmatic actually bill directly from the EMR node? We open an EMR node. We pick a patient. Okay. Xmatic pulls in from the database what it can find. The rest of the segments are to be filled out by the provider, by the doctor, via the node composer. Here are the segments that normally will need to be reviewed by the provider, by the doctor. One of these segments, or actually two, is diagnosis and services. So let's say the doctor comes at the end of his exam and he determines what type of diagnosis must be considered. Xmatic will throw probable diagnosis as a proposition. They don't need to be taken all. They can be taken all, but it is also possible to use only one or two. Let's take them all. Close. Which brings them into that segment. We move on to the services segment. Same thing. We select services. Let's say we take them all except this one. Take them all. No, wait. Take them all except this one. Okay. We go into the node and we see that in the node those diagnoses and those services have been properly entered. Now suppose the node is finished. The rest of the data has been entered too. The node can be saved. Can be saved plus, that means take this one and set me up a blank new one, but can also be closed into a case. So we click here. And what we see now is that the services selected are presented for master service selection. The master service is the service available on the case level, and serves as the title of the case. So let's say we want this to be a level 2 case. Having said that, Xmatic then says, I have 3 diagnoses for you to consider. Let's take them all. And then Xmatic says, I have your master servers, the one that identifies the case, but I can tell you that in the node the following services are referenced as having been performed. Those we want to bill. The other ones we exclude from current billing. Send this back. And we have a complete pre-calculated case. We can save this case, we can save